This episode of Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Inside the Breakthrough, a new history of science podcast full of did you know stuff.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Simms.
Welcome to a classic episode of Diabetes Connections. As always, though, we aim to educate and inspire about diabetes with a focus on people who use insulin. These classic episodes are something new this year. We are bringing back some interviews that are from the very first year and a half of the show. We started in 2015, coming up on 6 years. So there's a lot of episodes that newer listeners haven't heard, and it's kind of fun to go back and give some perspective. I like revisiting. I'm emailing everybody that was featured. If they're getting a classic episode, I'm sending them a text message or a DM or email, or, I'm just getting in touch with them to say anything you want to share, any new stuff. And it's been really fun to reconnect with some of those previous guests. So look, I'll be honest with you, I have really hesitated about bringing my older tech type episodes into this run of classics. We did a lot of interviews like we do now with the pump companies and technology and things like that. And I think it could just be kind of confusing if you're a newer listener, or if, you put a classic episode on and you're thinking it's new. But I mean, let's say I run an episode from 2015 when Dexcom, for example, is talking about an upcoming piece of technology that now in 2021 is outdated or never happened. So I'm purposefully avoiding most of those interviews. If you're interested, though, there's a great search box. I'm really proud of the website. It's very robust. You can go and search the 372 episodes that we have. Put in Dexcom, see how it's evolved over time. Put in Animus and find out what happened, that kind of stuff. Some of those types of interviews, though, especially from the do-it-yourself community, are, in my opinion, very valuable and very much worth revisiting. So that is the topic for this week. All right, come with me now. Let us go back to the olden days of diabetes, back before 2013. Now, I know most of you, that's not the olden days for real, but you think about what has changed since then. Before 2013, it was a time where continuous glucose monitors were used. They were around. We were at the time using, I want to say, the G4 Platinum Pediatric. But, you could use it. You had a nifty little receiver, but you could not share the data. And I don't believe in 2013 it was on anybody's phone. You definitely couldn't share. Then we saw the tweet. I've been on Twitter since 2008, thanks to my radio days. But I can't say that I was following John Costik at this time. But he was retweeted by somebody else I knew. And I saw this amazing thing. It was a dad watching his young son's blood sugar on the dad's laptop. The kid was in daycare. The dad was at home. They were across town from each other. In 2013, I started following that dad, John Costik, and of course, I was far from the only one. John linked up with others who were also working on improving existing diabetes technology, and all of that was really the start of Nightscout and a host of other we are not waiting type improvements, many of which are now integrated into commercial offerings. We are going to revisit that time with John Costik in just a moment and catch up on what he's doing now. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Inside the Breakthrough. On the surface, this podcast is a collection of fun, entertaining, and even surprising stories from the history of science. But host Dan Riskin digs deeper, and he really does entertain while drawing connections between these stories and the challenges faced by modern-day medical researchers. The latest episode, it was just released a couple of days ago. It is wild. Dan explains why it took a dozen people 200 years to discover and then undiscover a planet. I love this podcast. I'm so glad to partner with them. You can search for Inside the Breakthrough anywhere you listen to audio, wherever you found this podcast. And if you are listening through the website or social media, click on diabetes-connections.com and you'll see the Inside the Breakthrough logo. By the way, good time to remind you this podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Couple of things to know before we jump into the interview. I did reach out to John Costik, of course, as I mentioned, and he said, let's let folks know I'm hard at work on the iLet and its digital products. He is currently the director of digital product development at Beta Bionics. He would love that, and he says, hope you're doing well, Stacey. And if you are not familiar, the iLet is the product from Ed Damiano. We've had him on the show a couple of times. Beta Bionics is the company that is now developing it. And the iLet is finishing some clinical trials this year and should be submitted to the FDA pretty soon. I am speaking to the folks at Beta Bionic about coming on the show and giving us an update. So we will work on that as well. But also remember, this is from the fall of 2015. There are going to be dated references. I just want to kind of keep that in your brain because while it's fascinating to take a look back, you have to keep in mind as you listen that this is nearly 6 years ago. But I got to tell you, I'm just as excited listening back to this interview as I was when I first saw that tweet. John Costik, I am thrilled to have you as my guest this week. Welcome to Diabetes Connections.
Oh, thank you. It's thrilled to be here.
Thank you very much. Let's talk about how this all started. Your son was diagnosed in 2012. He was 4. But unlike a lot of people who have children diagnosed at any age, you had more technical knowledge than a lot of us. Can you take us through first, your diagnosis story? What happened to lead you to find out that your son had diabetes? And then, what made you think to look at the equipment and think, well, this isn't good enough?
Right. So it was late summer, end of August 2012, and Evan was showing sort of those classic signs that now we know are classic signs, right? That he was thirsty all the time, peeing all the time, and just, he'd get more lethargic as the day went on. And the 24th was a Friday, and my wife Laura went over to pick him up from daycare, surprise him with an early lunch. And when she got there, the instructor said, "He's so thirsty, he's crying." So she called me, and I was out for a run on the canal path, and I remember she told me what was going on. I said, that's not good, and he's been really thirsty and really sweaty past couple of days. I said, just, both of our guts were telling us, let's get him to the doctor. So she called our primary care, and unlike most appointments where they're like, well, yeah, we'll see you in a couple days, they were really quick to say, okay, come in at 1 o'clock. Then, so like a 1 hour delay from the time they called. So little did we know they knew pretty much right away what it was. So as soon as they got there, of course, he had to go to the bathroom. So they did the urine check, and he was clearly spilling sugar. So then they did the finger check, and he maxed it out. And they basically said, we're going to call the hospital. You get in the car and just go to the ER. We'll tell them you're on your way. And
did you know anything about diabetes at that point?
No. And this was, Laura was at the doctor, so she called me. I was at work at this point, and it was just like getting hit in the head, basically. And yeah, my knowledge of diabetes was very limited. I had some family members that were type 2, and I knew there was, type 1 and type 2, and one was curable, one wasn't. And that was mostly because growing up, my mother, she still is a nurse, but she's retired, but she was the school nurse, and there were a couple kids with type 1. And I remember just hearing stories of her having to, go to people's homes to pick up their insulin for them if they forgot it. So understanding that type 1 was distinctly different, I at least knew that much. But the next 3 days at the hospital, obviously, they put us through the type 1 boot camp and send you on your way, basically, with vials of insulin and, in our case, Humalog pen, and we had to sort of figure it out from there. They gave us the general guidelines for how much insulin he may or may not need, how much Lantus to give him, and we were on our way.
Now, it seems like you started on a continuous glucose monitor pretty quickly. How soon after you got home did you start thinking about that?
So it was mentioned to us while we were at the hospital by the endocrinologist that diagnosed him, and at the time it was the Dexcom 7 and I think it was still the Medtronic soft sensor at that point. So those were the only two that were shown to us, and we said, okay, it's a lot of information up front. So we actually went with shots and did a lot of finger checking initially. But one of the things we recognized real quickly was the ability to log this data and communicate this data was sort of hampered. If the nurse was writing things down in a logbook, that didn't inform Laura and I how Evan was doing during the day. So the first thing I did was set up a website for logging, nutritional data, finger checks, and how much insulin we were giving him. So that was within probably a week after diagnosis. I had some semblance of that, and that was to prepare him for going back to daycare so we could all stay in the loop. So that system would send Laura and I an email and a text message whenever a treatment was entered.
All right, so then a few months later, though, you decided to go with the Dexcom G4.
Yep, we started looking around November when it got approved. So I immediately signed up for all the diabetes technology newsletters and everything I could, and started, as my mind kind of settled down from the diagnosis, I started looking to see what can we use to keep him safer, healthier, both in the short term and long term. And the G4 was approved, I believe it was November, in that ballpark of 2012. So I began the process almost immediately to get that. It took a while to get it through insurance, because they actually like to see hypoglycemia before they'll give you tools to avoid it.
I know, and if you do too well, they might take it away. That's the craziest part.
Yeah, no. Your son's so healthy, he doesn't need the thing that's keeping him healthy.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, he did have a low in January that basically put us over the edge. And they approved it, and we had it in, the second or third week of February 2013. And that's when we began using that. And to us, immediately, it was just sort of a revelation to have this second order data, this trend data, along with the blood sugar, to know directionally where he's going and, what's happening in those periods that we were blind to before. So immediately after meals, we'd see these big spikes. They'd come right down. But, it got our mind spinning on what can we do to improve that. And at the same time, when we sent him to school, is there any way for us to have continued access to the CGM data?
Now, you and your wife both have backgrounds in engineering, correct? So this was something that you looked at. And what did you think of the system? Because somebody like me, I was a communications major in college. I've worked in broadcasting my whole life. I looked at the CGM and I thought, wow, this is so great. How could it get any better? You looked at it and thought, this is the dumbest device in terms of talking to anything else.
Right, but I understood the position that everything sort of has to go through that growing cycle. So I understood that. So my wife worked at an FDA regulated company, so we had some idea that putting a medical device online and presenting that data to people is more daunting for the commercial entity than it would be for us as individuals to just extend it. So I never really railed against Dexcom, and at the time I think they had sort of shown off some semblance of share, or there'd been some patents that came along that indicated that they were clearly moving towards remote monitoring at some point. But it wasn't something I was going to wait for, right? So I have the CGM now, this great device. I have a laptop that can talk to it, and I know I can take that data off and send it to a cloud service, or in our case, we just started with a simple Google spreadsheet that we sent the data to. And then I wrote an iPhone app that would pull that data down, and a web app so the school could just see, his current blood sugar and trend. So we integrated that with our care portal website, and that was powered by a laptop to upload. So initially I repurposed Dexcom's own, what they call a DLL, a linking library, dynamic linking library. So that's basically just a program that allows you to interface programmatically with the receiver. So I just repurposed that, wrote a fairly simple Windows application to just pull that data every 5 minutes and then upload it to that, like I said, that Google spreadsheet.
Okay, so I'm just curious. Was it hard for you to do that? Did it take you a long time, or did you sit down and tap, you're done, you got it?
It wasn't a challenge. So my background in software, it was relatively recent background, but it was all focused around Windows code and specifically writing these sorts of libraries for other hardware devices. So I understood if I took their library and put it into what I would call, a software project, that I would be able to see exactly the interfaces that could pull that data into my own application. So it really only took probably an hour or two to write the basic Windows uploader.
And then you put this picture on Twitter, I don't know how long after, that said, look at what we're doing, isn't that interesting? Mm-hmm. And did you expect the reaction that you got, which was basically, jaws dropping around the country saying, how do I do that?
Yeah, I took some pictures of the Windows one initially, and that didn't get a ton of attention. And when I started going after a truly ambulatory, like a mobile solution, that is what really drew people in. So I knew Evan was going to kindergarten, and I wanted him to be able to be remotely monitored no matter where he was, whether he was on the bus, in class, moving around. So I knew even a really small laptop wouldn't cut it. It just wouldn't be convenient for him. But if I could get a small smartphone, and do that, that would be great. So I started, and Android was really the only choice. They make it much easier to communicate with USB devices and other accessories. So I started working on that beginning of May, and about a week or two into May, I had sort of unraveled how Dexcom was communicating with the device and what that communication looked like and how to interpret that, and then send it along to a web service, to a cloud service. So those tweets got people's attention, and I think I chimed in on a bulletin board somewhere, and that's when Lane Desborough reached out and said, hey, I'd really like to do the same thing for my son. His room is too far for the receiver to be in our room and reach him, so we'd like to build a remote monitoring system.
Okay, so let me stop you there and tell me if this is all correct. Lane Desborough, now with Bigfoot Biomedical.
Yep.
He has an engineering background as well. I think he worked for Medtronic for a while, but he had designed his own home display system. He's the guy who came up with the Nightscout name, right? But he didn't connect it to the internet?
No, he did. So Lane really took my uploader and created that open source Nightscout backend. So the website you see today is an evolution of his original design and uses the same architecture. So a Mongo database and a Node.js application sitting on a web server somewhere and allowing people to view, their data or their a loved one's data.
Okay.
So that core was Lane's work, and later he brought on Ross Naylor, a software engineer, and they sort of refined that and got it to that point where it could go live. So for my part, they took my uploader code, I gave that to them, and I took their chart code and put that into our home system, and that's sort of where it took off. So in the middle of the summer, I started using the Pebble Watch because my whole goal this whole time was just how simple can I make this, how glanceable and easy can I make this for everybody involved? Because I don't want to stare at the chart all day at work. I just want to know when something's up. I want to be able to go on my day, but know that the system will tap me on the shoulder when it needs to. So the Pebble Watch was a good way to do that because you can make it vibrate and do all sorts of things to get your attention.
Okay, so now you've got it on your Pebble Watch. Lane Desborough and other people that you've mentioned are coming up with their own editions. When did what we now recognize as Nightscout, when did that all come into play? Was it a few weeks or months after you all kind of shared your codes?
So I think Lane started using that name fairly early on.
Right.
And we all met finally. Actually, Lane was in Rochester, New York, for a sailing competition that I believe he won at the end of August 2013. So he actually was at our house for Evan's first diaversary, and that was a great time. He and I got talking about everything, right? He's just an amazing individual and really inspired me and opened my eyes to look, there's a lot of people trying to do this, and right now between the two of us we have all the components to make it happen. So it was very inspiring because up until then, I was a software engineer at a supermarket, right?
Yeah.
So it wasn't something I'd considered. I lived in this small town. I never really looked beyond that. I liked my simple life, and part of my response to Evan's diabetes was I want my simple life back. So these were the tools I wanted to build that I needed to take it back, right?
Yeah.
But now seeing this really large unmet need across the entire, population of people with diabetes and their loved ones, woke me up to that. And then in November, I went to the D-Data Exchange, which is hosted by Tidepool and Diabetes Mine. And then Diabetes Mine has their Innovation Summit at the same, in that same couple days cycle. And that really sort of sealed the deal for me to see what Tidepool was doing as far as trying to integrate all this data. And I'm like, wow, okay, this is really happening. So I can either join in or not, right? And it just seemed like an obvious thing to, pitch in and see what we could do. So at that point, it was really just a matter of refining that code to a certain point where other people could make it work. And personally, I didn't think it would ever grow beyond, a sort of core, really technically savvy group of people that could set up their web server, set up the cloud service, right, and compile a Java application for their Android phone.
Well, that's what's remarkable about this whole movement is that you, as you say, this core of people is making it all available to people who have no real technical knowledge, who are completely intimidated by the whole thing, but want access to this information to the point where they're willing to get in a Facebook group and say, hey, can you help me? Right. And then people do it. People help. And It's been really remarkable to see how it's grown and how people like you are not just sharing your code, but sharing time to set up all of these systems. When you look back now, I mean, can you imagine that there's something like 14,000 people in the CGM in the Cloud Facebook group? I know not everybody's using the system, but they're there looking at this stuff. Did you think it would get this big?
No, not a clue. I mean, Laura and I, we had some inkling that what we built was awesome because it really enabled Evan to have as close to like that standard school kindergarten experience as we could have ever imagined after his diagnosis, right? He had to carry a little bag around, but he would have had to anyway, right? He'd always need his glucagon and glucose and finger checker. So it wasn't too much more of a burden to put a cell phone and the CGM monitor in there.
How's he doing? Go ahead.
Oh yeah. So it just enabled him, and we worked with the school nurse and we refined, our web application and our care portal to really be something that she was comfortable using. And something, that informed us, in real time of what was going on at school. So it was really just a nice experience. And again, like the daycare experience, we've had an amazing experience with the Livonia School District. The nurse in particular, she's just a wonderful person and just wants Evan to be happy and healthy and every kid in that school. So she's like Laura and I now. She knows his diabetes really well because she can just glance at it and she gets a really good sense for what's going on in his day and how he's feeling and how that will impact his blood sugar. And there's almost never an occasion where we have to chime in or even text her to say, hey, can you give him a gram or two? And if we do that, she's already on her way down or already calling down to make it happen. So it's just been an amazing thing for him and for us. And been wonderful.
How's he doing these days? He's in second grade now?
Yeah, second. He's doing good. So it's nice with the share receiver. We can use the Bluetooth connection so that rig has gotten smaller and simpler. It's wireless now. So we really can get his, physical burden of the devices to a minimum at this point. It's also improved outcomes tremendously. His A1C is great. His standard deviation, his time in range, all these things improve by having this sort of always on and easy access to all this diabetes data.
And you mentioned the Dexcom Share. We should note that Dexcom Share, Medtronic is coming out with a system that is similar, where instead of doing it yourself, they're setting it up for you. But that, and I don't know if I'm explaining this correctly, but there are still features that you all have set up and that the Nightscout folks have set up that are not included in the Share. Is that correct?
The main missing feature that people really enjoy, and it is that what folks refer to as raw data. So the ability to see some data during either a restart or a warm-up period, or during the dreaded triple question marks. You know, there's some visibility to data. You're not totally blacked out from that data with Nightscout, whereas the standard Dexcom system will do that.
Let me turn this around for just a moment and play devil's advocate.
Sure.
While many people, obviously thousands of people, use Nightscout and are excited about the Dexcom Share, there are a lot of people who have type 1 diabetes. I'm going to put teenagers in this category, probably, a lot of them, who feel as though this is a bit overbearing and who feel as though there needs to come a time when, you know, parents or others, you know, maybe don't have access to their numbers, or that this creates a situation where there's just so much hovering. Now, it's difficult for me to ask you about that because you're doing this for your family. You didn't do this for everybody else.
Right.
But what's your take on that? And Evan's still pretty little, but what's your take on that?
My take is always, and Laura and I have always said, you have to find the systems and build your own system to an extent, you know, whether you're selecting devices or features on those devices that suits you in that time, in that context of, I have a teenager with diabetes, I have a young child with diabetes. So, yeah, if you have a teenager that is very trustworthy and manages their diabetes really well, you know, maybe you're not going to look at that remote monitoring as an essential piece, right? And for folks that maybe worry more about their teenagers, I mean, at some point you do have to stand up and say, like, look, I'm your parent, hovering or not, I want to keep you safe and alive. And I think there probably is a balance that you have to find with the individual child, right? So if they feel it's really invasive, you know, how can we make the system less invasive? Maybe they don't always have an always-on access, but they get alerted to, you know, impending hypoglycemia, right? So there's always ways, since it's an open source system, people could take the system and really fine tune it to their particular needs. And for us, with Evan at his age, it's less about hovering and more about actually giving him more freedom, because us knowing what his blood sugar is allows him to just be a kid, right? And he doesn't get bothered nearly as much as he would if we didn't have it. So there is that sort of aspect that I think gets overlooked. You don't realize that it actually enables more freedom in most cases.
I think that is a great point, because it's a parenting question, right? It's not a technical question. The system exists and it's great, and how you use it is up to you. I've shared before, I've never used Nightscout. It's not something that when it first came out, I looked at that and said, we'll break that in about 3 seconds if we could even get it set up. It's just not us. And right. When Share came out, I was one of the people who got the Cradle and used it overnight, loved it, and never really felt like I needed to get an upgrade, because my son is at a point where he's at a terrific school. He's in 5th grade, and I did not feel that I needed to remote monitor, because he's at an age, and listen, I can get criticized for this, where I think it's better for him to make some mistakes in what I know, after all these years, is an incredibly safe and supportive environment. Mm-hmm. But I got the Share receiver, and I use it, as you said, finding it gives him more freedom. There's a tradition in my town where the 5th graders walk from school on Friday afternoons to our little town and are allowed for like 2 hours, the town tolerates them, running around, going to the soda shop. Yes, we have a soda shop. Going to the green, going to the library on their own. And I didn't want him doing that without, at the very least, a way to contact me. And we have both found that having the Share system, and he only really takes his cell phone to school on Fridays so I can see it, he doesn't even need to check in. I know what's going on. I'm not too worried about it. We text about, well, what are you going to eat and how are we going to deal with that? But it's made it so much easier. So as somebody who doesn't remote monitor on a regular basis, that little tool has given him freedom. If he was 2 years old, I mean, my son was diagnosed before he was 2. Mm-hmm. Would I feel differently? Probably. But it is. I think it's more a parenting question than a technical question, so maybe it wasn't fair to ask you.
No, I think it's fine, because ultimately, I mean, I'm a parent. All this came out of what I felt were our needs as a family.
Definitely.
To keep one of our family members safe and happy, and to improve the quality of life. It does come down to how how people use the tool. It can be very invasive if you're a parent that is constantly pinging that kid to do so, right? So really, the technology can enable hovering as much as reduce it, I think.
Yeah, and ask me again in middle school, and ask me again in high school. So, these things change as the kids change, right? And as the setup changes. Hey, you also shared your information with some recent guests of mine. I talked to Dana and Scott from the Open APS project, the Do-It-Yourself Pancreas System, and they're basically working on they are operating an artificial pancreas system that Dana has worn for almost 2 years now. They closed the loop last year. What do you think is going to happen next? What do you look at in technology and say, yeah, that's going to happen, and I'm going to have that for Evan?
That's a good question. So obviously, I want us all to be put out of business. Just cure it.
Exactly.
Let's go on with our life. But if there's a functional cure, whether it's Bigfoot's product or Dr. Damiano's product or somebody else, whether it's encapsulated iLet cells, via site, if they figure it out and are able to do an implant that reduces the insulin need significantly, if not eliminate it, those are the sort of things that make me excited, and I look forward to those. And Scott and Dana very clearly showed, look, you need to get this AP stuff rolling because it can be tremendously beneficial to people with diabetes, right? It reduces their burden, makes them much healthier, keeps their blood sugars in range, at a much higher percentage, right? Yeah, so early on I think it was Scott reached out to me, saw a couple tweets. He tweeted back and said, hey, how can I get this? So he was one of the folks that I shared the uploader code with early, before it was publicly available, before it was open source. Mm-hmm. I knew, looked into his background and we talked, and it was very clearly software-wise he was savvy. And so I was happy to share that with him. And Jason Calabrese was another person that I gave the uploader to earlier. And Jason Adams, who founded the Facebook group, was another one of these folks that early on had really reached out to me and got me rolling.
Well, let me interrupt you here. Why not make it more proprietary? I mean, why make it so easily available when obviously people were clamoring for this and probably would have paid you for it? So I feel like I should be twirling my mustache when I ask you that question.
That's a question we got a lot, actually. So when people saw our system, even before we made it open source, they said, oh, that's the $1 million idea. I said, yeah, but it's not really my idea, right? Everybody's had this idea. Scott Hanselman had the idea 15 years ago, Yeah. So very smart people know that the better we can access our data, the healthier we're going to be. So this was I just happened to be in the right time and right place. And to be honest, I'm not particularly entrepreneurial, so I wasn't super motivated to go out and start my own company and raise funds to get this done and dig my heels in with regulatory issues. It was me trying to get our simple life back, and starting a business around it would have been a huge risk and not something that I was particularly interested in doing.
Are you happy with how it turned out?
Yeah. I mean, if I had tried to commercialize it, how many people would be using it? Maybe none, right? Maybe it would have fizzled and people would still perhaps be waiting for the G5 or the share if that group hadn't come up and sort of opened the FDA's eyes to that need. So yeah, I think it's at this point the best possible outcome I could have imagined, and the appreciation from folks, and I don't deserve dearly any that I get. It was a small part of the story. It just happened to be, early on, but just that outpouring of gratitude. I mean, no one could have paid me enough to counter that.
And you are no longer doing software for Wegmans, is that correct? I mean, first of all,
that's right.
Which is a fantastic supermarket up in upstate New York and across really a lot of the Northeast that people are familiar with. And I used to shop there all the time when I lived in New York. But you're not there anymore. What are you doing?
So I've moved over to the University of Rochester Medical Center. So I was looking for something in healthcare because I knew, that's kind of where my heart was at this point, was really to help find similar needs throughout healthcare. So I didn't want to just do type 1 diabetes work. I really wanted to dig in and see what else we could do across a wide spectrum of conditions and and whatnot. So there was a position open at the University of Rochester Medical Center, a new group called the Center for Clinical Innovation. And I came in and got talking with the leaders of the group. It's a surgeon, Dr. Dave Mitten, and then Chris De Silva were the primary folks in the group. And we kind of hit it off, and I showed them what I'd built for Evan. And they said, hey, I think you'd be a perfect fit for our group. And the rest is sort of history. So I left Wegmans at the beginning of June and have been here and working on software that's very patient-centric. And
not just for diabetes.
No, not just for diabetes. So the main piece of software that our group has written will go out to all the clinics, or potentially all the clinics. They'd have to opt in to all the clinics at the University of Rochester Medical Center. So that entire health system, which is a big system. So we've built a tool that can aid all the clinics in gathering and interpreting patient-reported outcome data. So that's been a big push. And then I do have some projects that I can't announce yet for that are diabetes related, because they obviously know that that's always going to be a passion. So if I can work with the endocrinology groups here to sort of advance them along in their technology and how they use it at the clinical level, and how we can ease the movement of patient data to them, and while keeping the patient data very patient-centric and give them ownership of that data is sort of a goal there. But there will be I'll have some announcements at some point.
That's great. Well, congratulations. It sounds like the perfect job, and it's wonderful for the rest of us who are waiting to see what you're working on.
Yeah, no, it's been great, and it's a dream job. I can't complain.
It's nice when those things can happen. I'm curious, does your daughter, she's just a couple years older than Evan, right? Does she want the technology? Is she asking for a cell phone and that sort of thing?
She does have a cell phone and a Pebble watch, but we don't make her run, our watch face on it. But it's and then basically, we told her, he said, this is, since you have to sit with your brother on the bus anyway, if there were ever an issue where his blood sugar started dropping quickly, we gave her a tube of glucose tabs and a cell phone, so we can get a hold of her on the phone. Mm-hmm. You text her and say, hey, give your brother half a glucose tab, which we've only ever had to do maybe once or twice.
Yeah, but she's at the age where she still likes him, probably, because I have an older sister, younger brother situation here at my house, and when they were under 10, she was super helpful. And now, she's a teenager. It's like nothing to do with diabetes. It's just her stinky younger brother.
Yeah, I could see that coming.
But she'll still help him. She'd always help him, but.
I think so. They're both, I'm biased and all, but they're both very sweet and compassionate.
How old are they?
9 and 7.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yes, of course. Then they always will be.
No, I already see that breaking at breakfast time, where they're just needling each other. I'm like, okay, guys.
No, nice. It's all good stuff. It's all good stuff. John Costik, thank you so much for joining me. I spent a lot of time in upstate New York and central New York, so it's fun to talk to you from the Rochester area, right?
Yeah, you were in Syracuse, right?
I was in Syracuse and Utica. My husband is from Utica.
Yeah, my dad went to SU. And
excellent, me too. It's good
great
stuff. Well, thank you so much for joining me, and I can't wait to see what you're working on next. Please let me know, and we'll get the word out.
All righty. Thank you very much.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Simms.
Quick behind-the-scenes story about this episode from back in the day. I remember when my editor, and I think it was, I don't remember if it was John Buchanan. Sorry, John, as you're editing this. I don't remember if it was John or if I was still working with somebody else at that time. I listened back. I proof listen, I call it, to every episode, kind of like proofreading your work. And I got it back, and I was so excited because, as you know, I'm so excited by the DIY stuff, even though I don't understand half of it. And I couldn't wait to listen to it till I got home. And I was at Benny's baseball game, and I'm such a great mom. I'm like, no, I have to listen to this. So I'm listening. I'm walking around near the baseball field, kind of watching the game, kind of on my phone. And this was at the time when we did not have Share. Benny certainly did not have a cell phone. And we used to hang the Dexcom receiver by a clip on the dugout, on the wire mesh of the dugout. We used to just hang it there and like casually walk by occasionally, or just really rely on the alarms to go off. I loved baseball for diabetes. What a slow game. So many pauses, so many times to treat. I mean, the only thing that's problematic is sliding. And you can kind of figure that out by putting the Dexcom or putting your pump site in different places. But I will never forget, right by Davidson Elementary School in the ball fields over there, walking around and listen to playback of that original episode back in 2015. Okay, well, thank you to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Stacey Simms. I will see you back here next Tuesday for our very next episode. Until then, be kind to yourself.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Simms Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.